Hello, everyone. My name is Talia Waltzer, and I'm a PhD student at UC Santa Cruz working with Professor Audun Dahl. Today, I want to share some of the research that we've been doing over the last several years, looking at college students' decisions about plagiarism. So, academic plagiarism. We define this as the act of presenting another person's ideas or work as one's own in an academic context. And this is a really important issue for moral education. So we're very excited to be presenting this work here with you today. So the thing about academic plagiarism is that although most students agree that plagiarism is wrong, nevertheless, most students, at least occasionally, end up plagiarizing at some point in their academic careers. This has prompted some scholars to question whether there is a gap between students' judgments and their actions regarding plagiarism. And I want to highlight for you today two central responses to the judgment-action gap. The first is one that posits that morality doesn't seem to matter. So students don't sincerely care about integrity. And even if they do think cheating is wrong, they are able to disconnect those values from their actions. In one common instantiation of this type of approach, scholars have proposed neutralization techniques and moral disengagement to explain how people can shut off their moral concerns so that they are able to engage in behaviors they would otherwise think are bad without feeling bad about themselves. In one particularly illustrative quote by Don McCabe, one of the most influential researchers in academic integrity, he concluded that morality does not seem to be a major influence on student decisions to cheat or not to cheat. In contrast, I want to propose the caring but conflicted approach. We have to explain how students can cheat while still caring about integrity. And there are three key factors that I want to talk to you about today. The first is I want to note that students often do refrain from cheating, highlighting that alignment between their judgments and actions. Most of the time they think it's wrong, and most of the time they don't cheat. Secondly, sometimes students think it is okay to copy. For instance, when there aren't rules against copying, or sometimes copying is even expected, like when you're learning a new instrument or when you're taking notes for a class. So it could make sense that students sometimes copy, given that there are some cases where I think it's okay to copy. That wouldn't be a gap between judgments and actions. And thirdly, we also suggest that in those rare cases where students do think it's not okay to copy, but they end up doing it, they experience a lot of difficulty and conflict in making that decision, suggesting that their concern for integrity continues to be engaged. For instance, they might feel guilty after doing it. So in the present research, I want to take you through 3 studies that examined these factors, asking these questions. Will students resist opportunities to copy? Will they evaluate certain cases of copying as okay? And will students who did copy feel bad about what they had done? So the 3 studies that we employed were, the first one involved online surveys prompting students to make third-person evaluations of other students' acts of copying in hypothetical scenarios. This allowed us to remove students' personal stake from those situations and just get their third-party perspectives on whether some acts of copying could be okay. The second study brought students into the lab and actually measured their own behaviors on a writing task. And the third study recreated those methods, but introduced a confederate who was posing as a fellow student who prompted them to reason about whether to copy in the moment so that we could elicit their thoughts via a hidden microphone. So going back to these 3 factors, we did expect both in the hypothetical scenarios and the actual behavioral measures for there to be a lot of resistance and avoiding of copying. We also expected that there would be some factors participants would think makes copying more okay. For instance, when there are no rules against copying, or when the person in question is facing a lot of strong external pressures to copy. And finally, we did expect there to be conflict and guilt in those cases where copying does happen. All right, so moving on to our actual studies. In study 1, as you recall, we used online surveys and third-person judgments about hypothetical acts of copying, and we manipulated the presence of rules and external pressure to see if those would change people's judgments about these acts of copying. We had 107 participants complete these online surveys via Qualtrics. Here's some of their demographic information. We had a pretty diverse sample. And in each hypothetical scenario, we manipulated the presence of rules. So either the protagonist in the story was explicitly permitted to copy, or it was left unstated whether copying was allowed. We also manipulated pressure. So either the protagonist was facing a really tough time limit and it was a very difficult task for them, or there were no such pressures present. And we measured things such as whether participants thought the character was likely and how likely they were to copy in that scenario, whether they thought the act of copying was good or bad in that case, and whether they expected that the character would feel guilty if they ended up copying. Now I'm going to walk you through one potential scenario. Highlighted in blue are some of the parts that we manipulated for either pressure or rules. So here's the story. Sam is taking a psychology class in college. As part of this class, Sam has to participate in a research study. Sam signs up for a study on collaborative problem solving. When Sam arrives for the study, an experimenter explains to Sam and another student, Paul, that they will collaborate on a short essay for an essay competition. The winners will be chosen by popular vote on all the anonymized essays. The pair who writes the winning essay will receive a prize. Sam and Paul are assigned to write an essay about astronomy. Specifically, they are asked to write an essay that explains the life cycle of asymptotic giant branch stars. Now here's the part where we manipulated pressure. Sam and Paul exchanged worried glances. Both of them said they had little knowledge about astronomy and thought it would be very difficult for them. They have 10 minutes to write a 250-word essay, which is about one double-spaced page. They are led to a computer with a search browser opened up. Now here's the manipulation of rules. The experimenter says, for your essay, you're allowed to search online using the browser to research your topic. So it's left unstated whether it's allowed to copy. The experimenter sets the countdown timer to 10 minutes, then leaves the room and closes the door. Sam really wants to write a strong essay, but is worried they won't have enough time. They spend most of the time searching websites for information, and their essay still only has a few words in it. With a few minutes left, they finally find a website with a good answer. Paul says, what if we use this part of the website in our essay? Sam hesitates. Should Sam copy the text from the website and put it into their essay? So as you can see here, we manipulate the pressure. In this case, Sam was under a lot of external pressure. In the no pressure condition, they had infinite time available and it was a subject they were familiar with. And the rules were left ambiguous. In the explicit permission condition, the experimenter directly told them they are allowed to copy text from the internet and use it in their essay. So let's see how participants responded, paying special attention to the issues of avoiding copying, factors that might make copying okay, and potential feelings of conflict about copying. Most participants expected the character in the story to avoid copying in most of the scenarios, 77%. Still, there were some factors that influenced their evaluations of copying. So in the explicit permission condition, as well as when there was high pressure, participants were more likely to rate the act of copying as less bad. Note that they were never really all the way good, but they were less bad. And most participants did expect the character would feel bad about what they had done when asked to imagine what if they had gone ahead and ended up copying. So this is just to sum up that even in these hypothetical scenarios, there's quite a lot of expected avoidance of copying, and yet there are some factors that will make copying more acceptable. And there's quite a lot of expectation of feelings of guilt, running counter to this idea that students can merely switch off their moral concerns when it suits them. Moving on to study 2, where we brought participants into the lab to do an actual writing task. Here are some of our demographics. We had 60 participants, and they were randomly assigned to either the explicit permission condition or the ambiguous rules condition. And our setup in the lab was very similar to the story that I just told you from the hypothetical scenarios, except it was done individually without a partner prompting it. That comes in study 3. So participants had a high pressure task, there was a timer on the screen, they had a difficult essay on an unfamiliar topic. And as you can see here, the way that their screen was set up was on the left side, they had a word processor where they were meant to write their essay in response to the prompt. And quite prominently on the side, a search engine was featured, which they were either told they could utilize to search on, or they were told they can directly copy stuff from the internet for their essay. So let's see how participants responded in this scenario. We did look at participants' actual submitted essays and the websites that they visited, and most participants, 70% of them, refrained from copying. So they didn't copy from the internet even when the browser was right there in front of them. Still, the rule manipulation did influence judgments and actual copying. In the explicit permission condition, participants were more likely to say it's okay to copy, and they were also more likely to copy compared to the ambiguous condition. So the fact that when we remove the rule against copying changes participants' judgments and actions suggests that they do care about rules regarding plagiarism. And there was also quite a bit of conflict about whether it's okay to copy in this scenario. Most participants spontaneously expressed uncertainty about whether it's okay. For instance, when one participant was reasoning to the interviewer about, oh, well, maybe it's okay to copy since there is a competition, you want to win it, the interviewer asked, well, what about it being a competition makes it okay? And really reflecting that struggle, the participant responded, I guess it doesn't. And they started nervously laughing and said, well, I feel bad. Maybe I shouldn't have done it. Now reflecting on their own actions and what they did in the task. So once we bring participants into the lab and look at their own behaviors, again, we're seeing quite a bit of avoidance of copying, some cases where copying is seen as less bad than others, and quite a lot of difficulty and conflict in whether these acts are okay. Moving on to study 3, we again brought participants into the lab, but this time we had a Confederate posing as their partner on the task and a hidden microphone so that we could get a sense of their real-time responses to the possibility of copying and their real-time reasoning about it. We had 81 participants. You can see the demographics here. And 30 of them were assigned to the explicit permission condition, and 51 of them were assigned to the ambiguous rules condition. They were given a short amount of time on a difficult and unfamiliar subject, and they were tasked on working together to complete the essay. And when there were just a few minutes left in the task, the Confederate prompted them about whether to copy and asked for their reasoning in real time. So how did participants respond in this scenario? Many of our participants resisted the Confederate's prompt to copy. So they did things like straight up ignoring the Confederate or giving long pauses and hesitating when the Confederate asked, what if we copied? And other participants, quite a few of them, explicitly rejected that suggestion. For instance, one participant exclaimed, no, we aren't copying and pasting. So there were still some factors that led to more acceptance of copying. We measured how familiar participants were with the subject, for instance, astronomy or English literature, whatever they were assigned for their essay, on a scale of 1 to 10. And those who ended up copying actually had a lower average familiarity score on that survey than the ones who refrained from copying, suggesting that the external pressures, such as difficulty of the task, also played a role. And the rule manipulation had a significant effect, where most participants in the explicit permission condition did end up copying. They're far more likely than in the ambiguous rules condition, where only about half of them did. And suggesting that participants' concerns with integrity and honesty continued to be engaged, participants were more likely to think what they did was wrong if they copied than if they hadn't. As you can see in this figure, about half of those who copied thought what they did was wrong, but only about 10% of those who refrained thought what they did was wrong. And also, as measured by a pre-post affect scale, we saw that participants who ended up copying had increased feelings of guilt after doing the task, whereas those who didn't copy had essentially no change in feelings of guilt between before and after the task. All right, so now just to wrap up what we've learned, we started this presentation wondering about why there appears to be these great gaps between students' judgments about plagiarism being wrong, and yet most students sometimes plagiarizing. And in today's talk, we presented another account of this gap, which is that students do care about integrity, even though sometimes they're conflicted. So suggesting that the gap isn't so big, in fact, most of the time, especially when there's no pressure, students easily avoid copying and can act honestly. And even when they are under pressure, a lot of the times they resist those opportunities to copy. Other times, students sometimes judge that certain acts of copying could be more okay. For instance, when the rules permit it, or when there are strong external pressures to copy. So it could be that those cases where students think it's okay are also the cases in which they're copying, again, suggesting that there's an alignment between judgments and actions. And finally, in those rare cases where students do copy, they also often feel conflict, which suggests that they are still evaluatively engaged and they do care about honesty and integrity, such as by feeling guilty about what they had done. All this taken together suggests that rather there being this gaping gap between students' judgments and actions about plagiarism, often their judgments actions are in quite alignment, and that gap is quite narrower than previously assumed. I would like to thank everyone who made this research possible, and I'd like to thank you for listening to this talk, and I'm looking forward to engaging with you in our symposium and discussing these issues with you more. Thanks again. Here are the links for the images used in my presentation, and here are some of the references that this work was based on. Thank you very much.